right, well, welcome everybody to another in the series of trade webinars with American Gear Manufacturers Association and American Bearing Manufacturers Association. Very glad you could make it today. I'm Nate Bolin. I'm a partner with the law firm of K&L Gates based in Washington, D.C. And for those of you who were able to join our last installment of the trade webinar series, you heard a lot about what's likely to happen in the upcoming U.S. presidential election, as well as the House and Senate, and where we're going to go from there. One of the themes that came out of that discussion was certainly where the U.S. is headed with regard to its defense policy and defense industry, as well as its relationship with other key allies, partners, and others in the various places around the globe, but especially within Asia. We're going to talk a lot about that in this webinar. We're going to look at what the U.S. Congress is doing currently with regard to the current U.S. defense budget, where it's going to go for the next fiscal year, and talk about how that will impact companies in the gear and bearing industries in the United States and more broadly globally. We're going to talk also about some recent and very important developments in U.S. export controls to keep your eyes on as we move ahead to the rest of this year. And then we're going to switch gears a little bit and talk about three other parts of the Asia-Pacific region that are really dynamic in this space and are certainly ones that present opportunities for your companies as you look ahead to planning for upcoming years and potentially as they continue to expand their own defense industries. So those three countries are Australia, which we'll look at in the context of a new agreement that Australia has with the United States and the UK, as well as Japan, which is rapidly increasing its own defense budget and defense spending, and then India, which is also doing the same. And we'll look at some examples of how U.S. companies have been able to leverage that, particularly in your industries, and how you might want to look at that as well. So with that, here's just a summary of the overall agenda items. We're going to start with the United States and where Congress is at the moment with our national defense budget. For those of you who are familiar with the defense procurement operations within the United States, you are probably very well aware that there is an annual funding round that occurs within the U.S. Congress, known as the National Defense Authorization Act. And this is something that will fund most of the operations of the U.S. Department of Defense and some other agencies. We'll look at that in a little bit more detail in a moment. But this year, as has been the case for the past 5 to 6 years, the discussions in Congress around the National Defense Authorization Act and the funding programs is really dominated by discussions about what's happening within the Asia-Pacific region. And just to give you a flavor for that, it is certainly something that is both serious in tone and very, very far-reaching in potential impact. You have the announcements from and certainly developments from China. The People's Republic of China has been conducting very frequent military exercises around Taiwan, which is, of course, a separate government and maintains its own independence from the People's Republic of China. Whenever there is a political development, such as the recent elections that occurred in Taiwan, the People's Republic of China often responds to that with a new and very extensive set of military exercises in the waters surrounding Taiwan. The map that you see in the lower left is a reflection of the various zones and territories where those military exercises have taken place, at least through May of this year. And just last week, there were additional military exercises carried out in around the waters of Taiwan. This is all by way of trying to meet current Chinese President Xi's promise to have force readiness in order to invade Taiwan by 2027. So a mere 3 years away at most. And the clock on that is rapidly ticking. The U.S. government, in its own public statements, is taking that promise or that threat very seriously and is doing a lot of activities to try to prepare for it and be, working both with allies but also on its own to try to ensure that the U.S. has the ability to prevent Taiwan from being blockaded, for example, or for there to be a full-scale invasion of the island. Last week, I was at a talk by the current head of naval operations, which is essentially the U.S. Navy's logistics arm, making sure that the warfighters are armed and fed and supplied with what they need. And this is Admiral Franchetti, who made the very clear point that she has a clock that is ticking on her desk, counting down towards January 1st, 2027, and sees it as her number one mission priority to be ready for a U.S. ability to respond to any threats by China with regard to Taiwan. So I know that for some of you who are familiar with the whole history of Taiwan and its relationship with People's Republic of China and the United States, this has been something that's always been somewhat in an area of contention and dispute. But the level of that focus is growing more and more acute as every day goes by. And you see the US government taking that very seriously and preparing for it. That is something that is going to continue no matter who wins in November. And so I think you can take away from that that the US government's efforts generally are going to be dominated by what we need to be doing to enhance our capabilities and make sure we're able to respond in the event that there is some sort of a crisis in that region. It's also very much impacting our relationship with other allies in the region like South Korea and Japan, Philippines, Australia, and others. It is also very significantly driving a massive increase in defense spending more broadly across the entire Asia-Pacific region. And this chart, which was put together by the American Enterprise Institute, actually already is out of date because a lot of the figures that you see in this chart have now increased. Japan, for example, has a much higher budget level than what is shown in this chart. It's highest on record in the post-war period. There's some dispute about how large China's budget actually is because a lot of that is not publicly reported, but I think most experts agree that it is a very massive budget of defense spending, something that is a very dominant share of China's overall gross domestic product on an annual basis. And then you also see countries like India and Australia gradually increasing their own defense spending. This is something that has been very much unprecedented, certainly since the end of the Cold War, and reflects a return to just a very tension-filled atmosphere within the region. So as that situation unfolds and policymakers in Washington start to look at it or continue their planning for potential eventualities, you have a number of key developments. The first is that, of course, we have to continue to fund the U.S. military. That takes place through this annual appropriations process that I mentioned called the NDAA, or National Defense Authorization Act. And the debate over that is currently, Congress is in recess at the moment, but will return after the November election, and it will be the major topic of that Congress, which is what we call the lame duck session. So after Congress returns in November, and before the new president is inaugurated in January and the new Congress is sworn in, we'll have the ability and the very pressing need for Congress to do some legislation, and particularly funding legislation, with NDAA being the top priority. The current Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, has said that he is aiming to try to have the lame duck session be focused and making as much progress as possible on funding initiatives. We'll see how far that goes, but NDAA is one piece of legislation that is definitely going to be passed, and it's just a matter of what final form that takes. There are currently competing versions of one that was passed by the House, one that was passed by the Senate. The expectation is that those will be resolved through the reconciliation process, and there may be some amendments that are proposed and ultimately make it into the final pieces of legislation. Some of those amendments are worth watching because they may impact your companies, particularly with regard to new programs, procurement in certain areas that are, areas where there is a demand for gears or bearings or related technologies and services. And so if you have any interest in, or you have either historically been a U.S. defense contractor or you were looking at potential opportunities there, definitely worth keeping your eye on the developments within Congress on the NDAA and its amendments. So last year's NDAA funded approximately $841 billion, which was, to put that in context, about 2.9% of U.S. gross domestic product for that year. This year's budget, at least based on the Senate version of the NDAA that passed, that one seeks the higher amounts of $923 billion approximately for the upcoming fiscal year. And that constitutes approximately 3.1% of expected GDP for next year. Those are large amounts and certainly, very substantial, but the interesting point here to put this in further context is that they are still well below levels that were seen during the Cold War period, and even in certain periods of the early to mid 2000s. So the chart on the right-hand side of this slide shows you where, U.S. defense spending was as a percentage of annual GDP. And you see on an average basis, it was around 4%, a little bit higher than 4% over the period, the roughly 50-year period from 1974 to 2023. It's now currently below that and has generally been trending downwards in the past few years, even though arguably the level of threats facing the U.S. military and U.S. government in general internationally have grown in that period. So there are some calls and some within Congress who have proposed very significant increases, even beyond what the latest NDAA would propose, upwards of 5% of GDP. We'll see if that passes. I think in part that would depend on a number of factors, including the U.S. economy's performance, what happens with the tax legislation that is also a must pass next year. But I think generally speaking, the thought is that the current defense budget is still too low. There are a lot of new demands that we need to be looking towards. And some of the key ones, which have been brought out by the conflict in Ukraine, for example, are the fact that the U.S. lacks the ability to quickly ramp up production and capacity within certain key areas that might be needed in the event of a conflict with China over Taiwan, for example. And that was something that Admiral Franchetti also stressed in her remarks last week, was just the fact that the U.S. needs to do more, and we're moving as fast as we can, but certainly budgeting and other resource constraints are limiting that ability to a degree. So drilling down a little bit further within the NDAA that's been proposed, and this is looking at the Senate version, you have a little more granular detail. You'll see that a lot of the focus of this legislation, as has been the case for the past several years, is focusing on recruitment, retention, and training of the workforce for the U.S. military, which I think, as has been the case for many industries, and I know I hear this from your membership periodically, it's certainly a challenge for any manufacturing industry and to attract and retain good quality workers who are committed to staying with the company for the long term. The U.S. military is facing those same sorts of issues and is working through the budget to try to improve its retention rate and its recruitment rate. So a lot of the money in this budget is going towards those efforts, and it's likely to be the case for the longer term. But there is also an increased demand on trying to ensure the U.S. is investing in systems and equipment and technologies and R&D looking ahead, not just exclusively on workforce issues. One of the approaches the U.S. is taking, which is worth focusing in on if you're interested in what types of equipment the U.S. is procuring, how it's structuring its military bases in the region, and what type of defense spending we're likely to see over the coming years, is captured nicely in this article and video from the Wall Street Journal that came out last week. This one is looking at the U.S. reinvigoration of air bases and naval bases around the Pacific, places that had, at the end of World War II, hosted very significant U.S. Air Force or Army Air Force operations or naval operations. The picture you see on the screen here is of Tinian Island, which for the history buffs among you, you'll remember that was where the B-29 that dropped the atomic bomb on Hiroshima took off, and it was a major U.S. Air Force base for dealing with the air war over Japan at the time. That had gone dormant to the point where it was essentially covered with jungle, and the U.S. is in the process of expanding that airfield once again to have a backup. The same thing is happening with regard to Australia. There is a lot of investment in ability to interoperate with the Australian military and to also have teams of U.S. personnel, both Marines and others, available and on location within Australia, the ability to move around quickly. This strategy of being nimble and scatter and survive, as this article's headline illustrates, that is directed at the recognition that China has built up a very significant ballistic missile force, mainly conventionally armed, but one that could, if the U.S. has concentrated air bases in places like Guam and Okinawa, would be very vulnerable to a preemptive strike from China using its missile forces. And so the U.S. is trying to spread its cards around or its chips around to make sure that there isn't one juicy target there. So that is going to be definitely a factor in U.S. defense spending within the Asia Pacific region, and it's also going to drive a lot of spending by U.S. allies who are working with the United States in these efforts, and including Japan, the Philippines, South Korea, and others. So switching gears a little bit, the U.S. is also looking at, not just in terms of defense spending, but other policy efforts against trying to reduce China's capabilities in the military and related fields. One piece of legislation that came out of last year's NDAA process was a mandate that the U.S. Department of Commerce put in place new export controls aimed at military end users within China. This is a class of what you might expect, companies that are, or entities of the Chinese military that are supporting China's military investment efforts and growth and technology and other development efforts. But it also is increasingly aimed at companies within China that are found to be supporting those efforts. The Commerce Department at the end of July proposed a new set of rules that would significantly expand the export license requirements for U.S. companies working in or with China, trying to restrict the ability of China to get access to certain U.S. origin technologies or services provided by U.S. companies. That has not yet gone into effect, but we're expecting that it will go into effect possibly as early as before President Biden leaves office in January, and potentially as early as the end of this year. There was a round of comments on the proposed rules, and that comment period just closed this week. And the comments are interesting. You have a number of different companies weighing in and saying this is potentially too broad of a net, or the U.S. needs to make sure it's restricting the type of things that trigger a license requirement to make it manageable for companies that still need to work within civilian sectors of China's economy, like the auto industry, for example. The way that these export controls have been proposed is something that would have a very big impact on any bearing and gear companies working in or with customers in China, because one of the things that it would do is require you to get a license if you share any U.S. origin technology with a company in China that works in any way with the Chinese military. So, for example, if you have a Chinese automobile manufacturer that you might be supplying product to, or you're using U.S. technology to supply that product to them, if they happen to also be supplying the Chinese military with some item, even if it's not the item you're supplying, there's a really real risk that they would be designated as a military end user or a military support end user. And if that happened, you would need to get a license to do any work with them, even to supply them with things as simple as a pencil or a coffee cup. We will have to see if these comments that were raised are going to be ones that move the needle, that have Commerce Department change its approach. I think based on what we know right now, my expectation is that there will not be much of a change in the approach, and that the final rules or the interim final rules will look very much like what has been proposed. And I say that because these rules are being prompted not primarily by the Department of Commerce looking to put in place additional controls, but because the U.S. Congress actually mandated that this be done. And so I think the administration feels that it has a legislative mandate that it must perform and must execute on. And unless Congress goes back and changes the scope of what it's told them to do, it has very little room for maneuver. So for any companies in the membership that are working in or with China, this is a really important point to be looking at, because it could force you to stop operations if you are selling to China, or if you have U.S. persons who are working in or with China. The license requirements will take some time to play out to determine if you can even get a license under these new policies. And so it's something that will be coming up very quickly, and a lot of companies, based on what conversations we've been having, are not fully prepared for it. So definitely worth keeping your eye on. If you're interested in more of the detail here, there are is definitely a lot more that you can find through the links on this slide. But at a very high level, you have two concepts that are in play here. The first is that there are going to be new classes of companies and entities within China or that are Chinese owned or controlled that are going to be considered military support end users or some other flavor of military end users. And any transaction with those entities that involves U.S. origin technology, products, hardware, or software, et cetera, will normally require a license. In addition to that, if you are a company that has non-U.S. operations, but you happen to employ U.S. persons, so U.S. citizens or green card holders or dual citizens with a U.S. passport in those operations, and that could be in management, it could be in the workforce on the assembly line, it could be back office operations. The presence of a U.S. person in those operations is enough to also trigger these restrictions and force you to get a license if you're working with any of these military end users in China. So this will require companies to not only analyze what they're providing to China and who they're providing it to, but who within their workforce and management is doing that provision or that manufacturing or that back office support. And so this becomes an exercise and analysis that looks much more similar to the kind of analysis the companies have had to go through if they are looking at potentially doing business in the Middle East where there are sanctioned countries like Iran. And it's something that we expect will have a very much a chilling effect on U.S. companies and others doing business in or with China. So I think I've covered most of these other things to note. I think that really the key takeaway is that this will be very impactful and there's not a lot of time to prepare for it. We expect these rules to go into place soon, and it will require really a wholesale change in a lot of the operations that companies are doing in or with China, at least based on how the rules are written at this point. There have been some other changes, not just with regard to China, but more broadly for those of you who are operating in the defense space specifically. If you have operations or technology that's controlled by the International Traffic in Arms Regulations. These are the U.S. military export controls. There have been some changes in the definition of defense services, and I'm not going to go into this in detail in the interest of time, but if you are interested in this, it's worth taking a look at. It essentially also puts new license requirements on companies that have U.S. persons that happen to be operating in the defense services space. So that could be something like providing maintenance or R&D support or some other type of service activity, training as well with regard to military end items or military operations. So if you're doing, for example, maintenance, repair, and overhaul activities on aircraft that happen to be military aircraft, these rules may come into play. There is also a new class of export controls that have gone into place just on September 6th. So these are very recent. These are already in effect, so already legally operative. And these are aimed at categories of emerging and advanced technologies. So things that don't likely directly affect the bearing and gear industries, but the overall approach that the U.S. Commerce Department is taking in this area is one that is worth watching because this approach is the first time we've seen a very clear effort to have export control license requirements that have a very kind of carrot and stick approach and incentivize U.S. allies to try to implement similar or analogous export controls in their own laws. And what I mean by that is that there is a mechanism within these export controls that allows a partner trading country. So if the U.S. is trading with the United Kingdom and the United Kingdom implements export controls similar to the U.S. in this category of advanced technologies that the U.S. has imposed license requirements on, then because the U.S. has implemented these like-minded export controls, there's no export license requirement in trade in that class of technologies between the United States and the UK. So this is trying to provide an incentive for U.S. trading partners to implement similar controls so that if they do that, then they will no longer be subject to a license requirement. They can get better access to U.S. technology. That's the theory. We'll see how far that goes or whether that works out in practice, but this is an interesting development within export controls that we may see replicated in other areas as well. This has two main goals. First of all, it's obvious and definitely directly aimed at China, trying to prevent it from enhancing its own capabilities in a few key areas, especially semiconductors and aerospace. And then, as I mentioned, providing an incentive for U.S. allies and partners to adopt similar export controls. The technology and the scope of things that are covered by these new export controls, it's what you see here on the screen. Probably most relevant on this list for the bearing and gear industries would be the first two categories. So certain technology for aerospace, so ceramic composite coatings that might be used on components for aircraft or within aircraft engines, and then additive manufacturing equipment that is very advanced. For example, 3D printers that can print in a metal powder that you can then heat, treat, and fuse into a solid shape. That type of technology is now being subject to additional export controls. And this is a list, an example of part of the list of the various classes or categories of these new export controls that I'm mentioning, where the U.S. has looked at the export control laws of our allies and partners and determined that for some countries, they have their own equivalent export control laws in place. So to take the first category, this 2B910, this is a class of ceramic and advanced manufacturing equipment that is subject to U.S. export license requirements. But because the U.S. government has determined that Italy and the UK have similar export control laws, you don't need a license to export that particular type of equipment to Italy or the United Kingdom. And the idea is that the U.S. will gradually push out these like-minded country lists so that there would be something much closer to the kind of alignment we saw during the Cold War, where you could trade in a lot of different products between U.S. and NATO allies, for example, but you couldn't send them to the Soviet Union or states that had alliances with the Soviet Union. That similar approach is being taken here. Another area where the U.S. is trying to leverage its export controls and related laws to push back at China's ability to advance its own technology is in this information and communication technology and services space, where we have now seen the U.S. come out with a new set of restrictions on imports into the United States of connected vehicle technology. This is very recent. It just came out about 3 weeks ago. And the proposal, which President Biden has said he will sign and implement by the end of his term, will ban the import into the United States of vehicles, so passenger vehicles and others, that have connected vehicle technology that's manufactured in China. And that is a very specifically defined class of technology, but it's what you might expect. It's things like camera and collision detection systems, things that go into autonomous driving technologies, and systems that relay information about the vehicle, its performance, what its cameras and sensors are seeing, back to some server somewhere in the cloud. And that is something that if those technologies have these origin components in them, then they will be banned from import into the United States. This is going to take a while to fully implement. It will not be until 2027 that we see these rules become legally effective, but it, of course, means that companies need to be looking now at their supply chain. So you will likely start to receive, if you haven't already, new certifications from your customers that are asking you to certify that you are not supplying that with them with technology in these categories from China. And may also ask you to identify in some cases where you're sourcing the products that you are supplying. And we expect that a lot of companies that are, such as major North American automakers, for example, are not going to use a surgical approach here in seeking these certifications. They're going to send it to all their suppliers and their suppliers' suppliers and so on, and flow this down throughout the entire supply chain. So you will likely start to receive questions about where you're sourcing certain products if you're supplying it into the North American passenger vehicle or freight vehicle markets. I think most of the time you'll be able to certify that you do not supply any of these restricted technologies, but it will, of course, require some pretty intense diligence in some areas, particularly if you're supplying components that go into some aspect of an autonomous vehicle system, for example. The rule is yet to be fully fleshed out in terms of all the various parameters and cases where this can come up, but we do expect this to go into effect by January, and it will be something that all companies will have to be grappling with if they're working in the auto industry within the next 2 years. So another very significant development. And if you're interested in reading more about that, this is the link you can follow to the Commerce Department website that talks about the scope of the rule and what's likely to happen next. All right, so that was, as you can see, there are a lot of developments here within Washington, all of them aimed at China, all of them dealing with some aspect of China's own ability to get defensive capabilities, to increase its military capabilities, and to push the U.S. military to have greater force readiness and greater retention of personnel and recruitment to meet recruitment goals, all with the idea and looking towards a clock that really the alarm bell on it rings in 2027. So not that far away. Linked to those efforts is an effort between the United States and Australia and the United Kingdom that is known as the AUKUS agreement. So this is an acronym that stands for Australia, UK, and US, and it is something that focuses on the military capabilities of the three countries and how they can pool their efforts and their strategic locations to offer a counterbalance to China's growing military capabilities in the region. This map is a good illustration of sort of how this alliance is conceived of working. It is fundamentally based on what is called Pillar 1, which focuses on the submarine capabilities of the three nations, and is looking to have Australia add and create its own nuclear-powered, so a nuclear reactor in the sub, nuclear-powered but conventionally armed fleet that would be able to interoperate with the United States and with the nuclear-powered submarine forces of the United Kingdom, provide bases within Australia for those submarine fleets, and be able to patrol the Asia-Pacific region with a focus specifically on patrols in some of the flashpoints, such as around Taiwan. And that's reflected with these dotted circles that you see on the line here. It's something that also has another component to it, which is called Pillar 2. And Pillar 2 focuses on allowing better and facilitating better interoperability between the defense industries of the three AUKUS member nations. That is envisioned as being done through several things, including better co-development efforts, better coordination of procurement efforts among the three governments, but also within the private sector by lessening or reducing the export licensing burden on companies that want to, for example, develop a product in Australia and then be able to sell that to the US government and the UK government, or engage in a cross-border R&D effort between the three countries or two of the three countries to develop something new that would be too capital intensive to do just within one of those countries. And then also enabling, those who are making hardware that falls within the US export control regulations, for example, if you have ITAR regulated hardware, high-speed bearings that are survivable in certain conditions or certain types of metallic gears, et cetera, to be able to send those and sell those to the Australian government or a private party that's contracted for the Australian government in Australia without having to go through a lot of red tape and get a license. So those export controls are now already in effect. And for a whole class of items, you no longer need an export license to send those to Australia or the United Kingdom. There are certain exceptions to that, but by and large, it has opened up a whole new class of national security related trade with the three countries in those areas where you no longer need a license when you used to have to go and get one every time. For those of you who are interested in exploring this, it's definitely worth focusing in on the specifics of what is now allowed without a license and what is. But this is something where it's not only an effort of the US to reduce the licensing burdens, but the UK and Australia, most notably, have also implemented new regulations and new legislation to make this possible. So this is something that is going to present a lot of new opportunities for US and UK and Australian companies and for companies that want to base their operations in those three countries. It's going to open up a whole new field of co-development opportunities within the military sector, but more broadly, space, aerospace, and others. And it's something that we're already seeing companies use and leverage as a way to have a faster development cycle at lower cost with a broader customer base where they're not just selling to the US government, but they're also selling to the UK and the Australian governments as well. And that's something where, for example, we've seen companies successfully actually do their R&D effort within Australia and then market the results of that effort to the US and the UK governments with a very, very fast turnaround time in their development process. And so you may start to also hear, even if you're not doing this directly as a company, you may start to see requests or new business opportunities open up for your customers that are working in these areas within the AUKUS space. Definitely something to watch. As with most things in Washington, however, this approach is not without its criticisms, and Congress, which mandated that the AUKUS agreement be implemented, is actually, at least for some key leaders within Congress, not particularly happy with the Biden administration about the pace of its implementation of the AUKUS agreement. And so you had this letter that came out from House Foreign Affairs Committee Chairman Mike McCall and House Armed Services Committee Chairman Mike Rogers, both very influential within the House of Representatives, criticizing the Biden administration for not moving fast enough in lifting these export controls with regard to Australia and the UK. What the end result of this criticism will be remains to be seen, but I think it's fair to say that we can expect that this will remain an issue going forward into whoever becomes president's term next year, and that we may see further lifting of export license requirements in this area, and in turn further co-development and cross-border efforts with three countries. Okay, so again, shifting gears, AUKUS right now is an agreement, just by its very name, is between the three countries of Australia, the UK, and the United States, but there is a discussion ongoing about potentially adding other partners to that agreement or other agreements that look like it. And one of the countries at the top of the list for that effort is Japan. Japan is currently on its own, recognizing the rising threat picture within the region and taking steps to respond to that in ways that are really unprecedented in the post-war period. As some of you may know, Japan has, as part of its post-war constitution, a clause that prohibits it from maintaining military forces that allow force projection overseas. That policy has been changing within the Japanese government. Japan is increasing its own defense budgets to a very significant degree with the goal of having more effective deterrence against China and to a degree also North Korea and Russia within the region by having the ability to have a counterstrike capability if it's attacked, by having the better ability to protect its extensive island chain from potential incursions from Chinese Coast Guard and other vessels, and advancing technology in a whole range of areas of aerospace, many of those with the goal of being interoperable with the US and other allies and partners. There was a speech by then Prime Minister of Japan, Kishida, before the US Congress earlier this year. It's worth taking a look at. One of the cornerstones of the speech was about how Japan can really step up and be a more involved partner with the United States in this national security and foreign policy space within the Asia Pacific by, among other things, increasing its own defense budget and its investments in technologies that are going to give the allies an edge in any future conflict. That general policy has been pursued since Prime Minister Kishida stepped down, and there was a new prime minister selected in September. This is Shigeru, who is currently Japan's prime minister, currently campaigning together with his colleagues for a general election that's going to be completed by this Sunday. So we'll see if he and his party survive. The expectation currently is that they will, and he'll remain prime minister, although maybe with a smaller majority in the Japanese parliament. But he is notable in that he was defense minister for many years under Prime Minister Abe, and he was a big part of the motivation for Japan to increase its defense spending overall. The takeaway from that is that I think if he continues to be president, to be prime minister, then Japan will continue down this path of increased defense budgets and further investment in these key areas. What does that look like in practice? Well, you see here that for fiscal year 2025, Japan has proposed an annual defense budget of almost $60 billion. If you recall the slide at the beginning of the presentation with the map of the Asia Pacific, and Japan's defense spending was around 46 billion just 3 years ago. This is a massive increase for Japan. It's an increase that is unprecedented in the post-war period, and it reflects a continuing increase in defense spending overall, to the point where Japan is aiming towards having its defense spending as a percentage of its annual GDP reach 2% by fiscal year 2027. So there's a commitment here. It's reflective of the force goals that the Japanese government has outlined in its own defense strategy, as well as a recognition that the neighborhood where Japan is increasingly growing more and more dangerous. What are some of the priorities where Japan is spending that money? Well, it's focusing on standoff defense capabilities. So things like a long-range weapon, the ability to have a hypersonic response to if attacked by China's missile forces, for example, to have an early warning satellite constellation, a complement or a counterpart to the GPS systems and others that the US and other countries maintain, but essentially allowing Japan to have its own independent ability to strike back if it's attacked. There are also air and missile defense capabilities that Japan is working on, particularly to counter the threat of, a limited strike from North Korea or potential other threats. You see an increase in spending on unmanned defense capabilities, particularly important for Japan, which is seeing a shrinking population and has always struggled for recruitment for its own self-defense forces. The aircraft you see in the lower left is an example of that. That's a new proposal that just was released earlier this month of a unmanned aircraft that would be both stealthy and also have the ability to operate together with others in concert, reducing the need for as many trained pilots and other infrastructure. The aircraft that you see in the center there is a project that Japan is working on with Italy and the UK to develop a new generation fighter aircraft that would be similar or more advanced than the F-35 fighter, and would be one where the three countries are sharing a lot of the development costs. The ability to increase these operational capabilities, both within terrestrial but also in space, and having better command and control functions, these are all ones that the Japanese government is pushing towards. As well as, similar to the US, focusing in on its ability to manufacture and scale up production of consumable items within, if Japan gets involved in the conflict, things like artillery shells and other things. All those are definitely priorities. So this is something, again, unprecedented. It's something where there's a big participation from US defense contractors as well as others in the UK, Italy, and other NATO countries, but one where there are a number of opportunities for companies that are going to be part of that supply chain that can leverage their own research, their own connections with other allied countries. If you've been a defense contractor for a US military project for a long time or have that experience, it's worth looking at what Japan is doing and whether there might be opportunities in that market as well. And then lastly, we'll talk a little bit about what's happening within India. India has a number of demands on its own defense budget and its own set of threats that it faces as a country. It's historically had very poor relations with its neighbor Pakistan since the partition of India after the British left. The two countries fought a major war in the 1970s, and a lot of India's defense spending historically has been geared towards providing a counterbalance or a ability to have a credible threat of retaliation if attacked by Pakistan. At the same time, India shares a border with China. There have been border conflicts there that have been quite serious. A couple of years ago, there was a big clash between the Chinese and Indian forces. It didn't result in gunfire, but in which several soldiers died on both sides. And India has been increasingly looking towards trying to counterbalance that threat as well. Up until recently, it has done that largely through the procurement of systems from once the Soviet Union and now Russia. But having looked at the experience of Russian forces within Ukraine and the survivability of a lot of the Russian equipment being very poor in that conflict, I think India has had a lot of second thoughts about that. It has also been trying to work more closely with the US and other allied countries in terms of maintaining sanctions against Russia, although not with as much of a commitment as you see among NATO allies, for example. Um, all this is coming in the context of increased spending. So you have India also, its own defense budget is increased to 75 billion, so larger than Japan's, even though India's GDP is smaller. And you have the prioritization of domestically developed technologies. India is continuing to make a lot of advances in aerospace. It's been successful in some of its space exploration activities, anti-satellite activities, all reflective of an increased focus from the government on investing in those technologies and leveraging India's young population with a lot of trained engineers to give it an edge in development. It's also something where the efforts to move away from reliance on Russia and Russian systems have prompted India to seek investment from US companies like General Electric, which makes the engine that you see there on the lower left. This is the one used in the F-18 fighter aircraft, but also is now being used by India for purposes of its own homegrown fighter aircraft platform. And again, as has been the case for Australia and Japan as well, India presents a lot of opportunities for companies in the bearing and gear industries. You see here, for example, the press release from last year of Rave Gears, which is a Texas-based gear manufacturer working with an Indian company in the aerospace sector to develop gears that are used in rotary wing aircraft being produced in India. So a lot of opportunities here. Indian companies, in our experience, are very eager to be working and partnering with US companies. And it's something that, in many cases, there haven't been a lot of historic competitors outside of Russian companies that may have been involved in some of these sectors. So it's in some ways somewhat of a greenfield opportunity in some areas. So a lot of changes, a lot of opportunities. The direction of travel in all these cases is one where you can expect to see continued budget increases, continued focus on the investments in this area, and as a result of that, increasing opportunities for companies that have a technology that or an interest in supporting the defense sectors in these areas, while at the same time having the US government being much more supportive of that type of cross-border work among the various countries that we've discussed today, all being driven by the threat picture that China is presenting in the region. So with that, I'll leave it there. If there are any questions that you have after this presentation, please feel free to reach out, and we'll make sure that you get a copy of the slides and the recording if you're interested in taking a look at anything later. And definitely thank you for your attention, and we'll look forward to seeing you next month when my colleagues who focus on energy issues are going to be presenting a picture after the election of where we stand in terms of US regulation in energy markets, what opportunities are there in the electric vehicle and electric vehicle supply chains. So if your companies are interested in that area, it's definitely one to make sure you take a look at. I look forward to seeing you then. And until then, have a great month ahead and enjoy the great fall weather. Take care.